The thin air hit his lungs like a cold, wet slap. GRU Major Andrei Orlov, commander of the Zaslin 7 Operational Tactical Group, landed hard. His legs buckled for a moment, but long-standing habit kept his body upright. The soft, yielding moss dampened the rest of his inertia. Around him, breaking branches and crushing undergrowth, the remaining 6 fighters of his squad landed on the ground. The last one to land, with a dull thud of containers with equipment, was Sergeant Lykov, bringing up the rear. The silence, broken only for a few seconds, closed over them again, dense and almost tangible. Status. Report when ready. Orlov's mental order was not spoken out loud. It flashed through the protected neural network. Contact 1, flaring up as a short tactical directive on the periphery of each fighter's consciousness. It was an experimental system, the pride of a secret research institute, turning the squad into a single organism. Orlov felt not only their responses, but also background data streams. The calm, even pulse of veteran demolition expert Grimov, the slightly increased heartbeat of a young sniper Vorobyov, who was not yet accustomed to parachute-less landing from extremely low altitudes. The first to respond was Lieutenant Sedek, the group staff physician and scientific specialist. Ready. Biometrics are normal. The air is clean. Background radiation is 0.100th of a microsievert, within normal limits. Ready, ready, ready. Short mental impulses of confirmation poured in one after another. The network was working stably. Orlov glanced around the landing site. Square 73-4, East Siberian taiga, an unmarked patch of wilderness hundreds of kilometers from the nearest human habitation. Giant trees covered in gray lichen stood so close together that they almost completely obscured the low, leaden sky. Underfoot was a springy carpet of moss and rotting pine needles, damp and cold even through the thick soles of his tactical boots. But something was wrong. The major, who had spent half his service in such forests, sensed it almost immediately. Silence. Not just the absence of human sounds, complete, absolute silence. No birds sang, no insects chirped, no small animals rustled in the bushes. The forest was dead, or asleep. "Commander, the compasses are dancing," reported Scout Makarov, pointing to his wrist device. The needle twitched chaotically, unable to find the north. The electronic one is also malfunctioning. "Weak magnetic anomaly," confirmed Sedek, checking the readings on his tablet. "Perhaps iron or deposits." Or, he didn't finish. Everyone knew what else could be the source of interference. Object Kedr 4, an experimental new generation spy satellite, officially a meteorological research device, unofficially a carrier of an autonomous reconnaissance AI, and, as they whispered in the corridors of the center, something else, something biological. The object left orbit 48 hours ago. The reason? A systems failure. The task of Zaslin 7 was extremely clear. Find, extract from the hull the central memory unit and the flight recorder, and then destroy the remains of the device with thermite charges. Leave no trace. Moving to the estimated impact point. Distance is 400 meters to the northeast. Makarov, you're in front. Vorobyov, cover the rear. Maintain complete radio silence. Communication only through contact. We are working, Orlov ordered. The squad moved forward as silent shadows. Each step echoed in the neural network as a light tactile echo. Orlov saw what Makarov saw. Walking 30 meters ahead, a tangle of roots, a fallen tree, a dark ravine. At the same time, he felt Vorobyov's intense attention, monitoring their backs. The contact, one system was a miracle of technology, but it had a side effect. It erased the boundaries of personality, turning individual fears and doubts into a common, low-frequency hum of anxiety. And now this hum was stronger than usual. The silence was oppressive. It seemed that the air itself had become dense, viscous, resisting their movement. 10 minutes later, Makarov froze. I see. There's a clearing ahead. Something's wrong. They came out onto the edge of a huge crater, as if burned out in the very heart of the forest. About 50 meters in diameter, it was perfectly round. The ground inside it had melted, turning into black, cracked glass. A barely perceptible smell of ozone and burnt plastic emanated from the edges. The trees around the perimeter had been knocked outward, their trunks charred on one side. This was the crash site, but the satellite itself was not there. Empty, Gromov stated, descending to the bottom of the crater. His boots crunched on the frozen crust. Not a single piece of debris. Nothing at all. As if it was simply evaporated. Orlov frowned. A thermite charge wouldn't have produced such purity. It would have left traces of metal, ceramics. But here, nothing. Absolute emptiness in the center of the affected area. "Major, come here," Sedek called. He was standing at the opposite edge of the crater. As he approached, Orlov saw something that made his heart skip a beat. A wide, deep furrow led from the crater deep into the thicket. It was cut into the ground as if the multi-ton, massive object had not simply fallen, but had been dragged along the ground, breaking trees and uprooting boulders. The satellite had not evaporated. It had been dragged away. A bear? A pack of wolves? Young Vorobyov suggested, but his mental voice trembled with uncertainty. To move a 3-ton apparatus? Unlikely, Orlov snapped, squatting down at the beginning of the furrow. He ran his gloved hand along the ground, and then he noticed it, a strange, barely discernible crimson coating. It covered the ground in spots, like spilled paint. But it was not paint. On closer inspection, Orlov saw a very fine, almost cobweb-like structure. It was something alive, something like moss, but an irregular, unhealthy, blood-red hue. "Sedek, what is this?" The lieutenant knelt down next to him, taking the analyzer out of the container. He took a sample and placed it in the receiver. The device hummed quietly for a few seconds, then displayed the result on a small screen. Unknown life form. Organic structure, mycelium or lichen. But strange. The detector registers weak but constant electrical activity, like a neural network, only at a microscopic level. Never seen anything like it. This is unearthly flora. Orlov looked up, a furrow leading into the dark thicket, and that strange, thinking moss covering its tracks. A single thought pounded in his head, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. Biological material on board. The crash had not been an accident, and they were not the first here. Someone or something had been waiting for Kedr, for to fall from the sky. And now it had him. The evacuation mission had just turned into something else entirely. And something far more terrifying. We're following the trail. Be careful. Makarov, your eyes are our eyes. Any movement, any sound, report immediately. Orlov's mental order was dry and devoid of emotion. But underneath it, in the depths of the shared neural network, each member of the squad felt an icy touch of anxiety. The decision was made without hesitation. Abandoning an object of national importance, even if damaged, was unthinkable. But now, going deeper into the forest along the ugly scar left on the body of the taiga, Orlov increasingly wondered, are they hunters here? They walked for about an hour. The silence of the forest became even more oppressive. It seemed to have acquired density and weight, pressing on their shoulders, getting into their ears. The crimson coating they had noticed near the funnel was now becoming more and more common. It covered the tree trunks like a painful rash, entwined the roots, grew through the carpets of ordinary green moss, displacing it. Lieutenant Sedek, constantly checking his analyzer, reported the growing electrical activity of this substance. "Commander, it's reacting to us." His alarmed impulse sounded in the network. The closer we get, the higher the frequency of the impulses. "It senses us." The furrow led them to the foot of a low but massive rock ridge that looked like a monolithic wall of gray granite. The trail ended right at the stone. A dead end. "Halt! Take a look around," Orlov commanded. Makarov, moving smoothly and silently, like a ghost, began to examine the rock. The others took up a circular defense, their weapons nervously scanning the frozen, silent thicket. Orlov approached the place where the trail ended. Here, red moss was everywhere. It covered the foot of the rock with a thick, pulsating carpet. The major noticed that the pulsation was not chaotic. Faint, dim flashes of light ran across the organic mass, converging at one point. A point that at first glance was no different from the rest of the rock surface. "Makarov, come here." "Look." The scout approached, his professional gaze instantly assessing the situation. He ran his hand over the stone, brushing away moss and caked dirt. A thin, almost invisible crack appeared beneath them. An outline. "Door," he breathed out loud, breaking the radio silence order. Top-notch camouflage. Composite panels that matched the color and texture of the rock. Old work. Very old. Together they found the edge of the massive door. It was open a couple of centimeters, enough to notice it, but not enough to enter. The outer surface was covered in deep scratches and dents. Whoever had stolen the satellite did not know the access codes. They had simply smashed the multi-ton armored door with brute, inhuman strength. Gromov, the demolition specialist, took out a hydraulic expander. The device hissed as it pressed against the metal. With a drawn-out, agonizing screech that made your ears pop, the gap began to grow. When the passage became wide enough for a man to squeeze through, a cold smell wafted from within. Not just the cool of a dungeon, but a grave, freezing cold, mixed with the smell of ozone, mold, and something else tart, chemical, unfamiliar. "Coming in. Full combat readiness. Sector control," Orlov ordered, being the first to step into the darkness. They found themselves in a long, downward-sloping concrete corridor. The emergency lights on the walls, coated in a thick layer of dust, occasionally flared with a dim, orange light, snatching a depressing picture from the darkness. The walls were crying with dampness. Garlands of torn cables hung from the ceiling. And everywhere there was it, the red moss. Here, away from the sunlight, it glowed much brighter. Billions of tiny spores phosphorescent, filling the corridor with a ghostly, crimson glow. The pulsation became distinct, slow, and rhythmic, like the beating of a huge, invisible heart. "Life support systems are active," Sedek reported, his voice in the neural network sounding tense. "Ventilation, main power supply, everything works. But it doesn't work properly. With interruptions, power surges. As if something is trying to control the systems, but doesn't fully understand how they work." The squad's footsteps echoed loudly in the silence. They passed through several rooms. An empty weapons warehouse, a dining room with decayed plates laid out on the tables, a residential block with neatly made beds covered in a layer of dust. This bunker had been abandoned in a hurry, but abandoned long ago. Decades ago. But who or what made it wake up again? With each step deeper into the facility, the glow of the moss became more intense. It covered not only the walls and the floor, but also the equipment. Control panels covered in rust, broken monitors, racks with dead electronics. And everywhere the same picture. Thin, root-like strands of moss penetrated the housings of the devices, braided the wires, grew into the connectors. Finally, they came out into the central hall. It was a huge, round room with a high domed ceiling, and in the very center of it lay it. Object Cadre 4, or rather, what was left of it. The satellite's casing had been ripped open like a tin can. From its torn guts, from a complex jumble of microcircuits, cables, and titanium frames, hundreds of dense, sinewy strands of red moss stretched toward the bunker systems. They spread across the floor and walls, connecting to power cables, ventilation shafts, control terminals. The satellite was no longer a piece of dead metal. It had become a heart, the heart of this living, thinking, breathing bunker. There was chaos around the device. Scattered instruments, boxes of equipment, an overturned table. Clearly, an improvised laboratory had been set up here. Sheets of paper, covered in hasty handwriting, formulas, and diagrams, were scattered on the floor. Major, Vorobyov's mental call was barely audible. He pointed the barrel of his rifle at the far corner of the room. There, by the wall behind the equipment rack, was something, a figure, motionless, hunched over, everyone in place. "I'll check." Orlov slowly moved forward, keeping the figure in his sights. As he got closer, he realized that it was not a threat. It was the source of all the answers, and at the same time, a terrible warning. But they would learn about that a little later. Now, before them was only the final point of their search. They had found the satellite, and now they were locked in a cold house that was watching them with every luminous fiber, attentively and dispassionately. And in this dead silence, Orlov felt real, primal fear for the first time. Not for himself, for what they had woken up. Figure by the wall, motionless, no signs of aggression. "I'm closing in." Sedek, Grimov, cover. The rest, control the perimeter. Focus on the central object. Any changes in Moss activity, report. Orlov's command passed through the neural network in a smooth, cold stream, but he felt how behind this external calm a collective tension was growing. It was like the hum of a high-voltage line, invisible but felt by the skin. The Major moved slowly, closing the distance step by step. The crimson glow emanating from the satellite heart and the biomass enveloping the bunker cast distorted, dancing shadows on the walls. The hunched silhouette did not move. When he was 10 meters away, Orlov understood why. It was a corpse, but not just any corpse lying on the floor. It was something far more monstrous. The man in the decayed lab coat was part of the wall. His body, dried out and mummified, seemed to have grown into the concrete. His right hand was stretched out toward the equipment rack, his fingers curled, as if he was trying to turn something on or off with a final effort. But that wasn't the worst part. From under the coat, through the fabric, from his eye sockets and his mouth, open in a silent scream, the same red, glowing strands of moss grew. They entwined the body, going deep into the wall and connecting with the general, pulsating network that covered the entire bunker. The man had not been killed. He had been assimilated, absorbed. "Commander, what is this?" Vorobyov's mental whisper was full of superstitious horror. "This is our scientist. Looks like he found what he was looking for." Orlov answered gloomily, signaling Sedek to come closer. The lieutenant, the squad's resident medic and scientist, approached cautiously, his face pale beneath his helmet. He silently examined the body, shining his flashlight on it. Complete symbiosis, or rather absorption. The organism integrated his biological mass into its structure. Judging by the degree of mummification, he has been dead for several weeks, maybe a month, concluded Sedek, his voice strained with a mixture of scientific interest and disgust. He became part of this ecosystem. Next to the body, on an overturned box, lay a thick notebook in a cracked cardboard cover. A general notebook, a standard one, with 96 sheets. Millions of them were produced in the Soviet Union. Orloff carefully picked it up. The paper was damp, but the ink, written in a neat, calligraphic hand, was well preserved. It was a diary. We read, "The Major ordered briefly." They moved to the center of the room, keeping all entrances and exits under control. Sedek opened the first page. September 12th, 1983. My exile is over. I am here. Facility Arc 3. How ironic. An abandoned, deep bunker, decommissioned and forgotten under Khrushchev. The perfect place to continue my life's work, far from the short-sighted idiots at the Academy of Sciences. They called my research into adaptive genetic modification dangerous and immoral. Fools! They fear evolution, and I seek to lead it. Here, in silence and isolation, no one will disturb me. The entries for several years describe the routine of a hermit scientist. Professor Alexei Igorevich Reshetnikov, once a luminary of Soviet genetics who fell into disgrace for his overly radical ideas, was setting up his laboratory. He described his experiments with local flora and fauna, trying to create life forms that could survive in any, even the most extreme, conditions. The entry, dated 3 months earlier, was written in a completely different, agitated tone. April 21st, 1987. Incredible. Tonight the heavens gave me a miracle. A fireball that streaked across the sky and crashed somewhere north of the bunker. Seismographs recorded a powerful impact. It was not a meteorite. The trajectory of the fall was controlled until the last moment. It was a device. Their device. Tomorrow I'm going to search. My heart is pounding like a young man's. I feel that this is a sign. My solitude is over. The real work begins. The following pages were full of technical calculations and sketches. Reshetnikov, using a winch and his own improvised tractor, spent several days towing the multi-ton satellite to a shelter. He opened it up, admiring the advanced technology, but that was not what he was looking for. April 28th, 1987. I found it. In a special cryogenic container, protected by 3 levels of biometric locks, which I managed to bypass. It was stored. The Omega sample, an extraterrestrial microorganism. The architecture of its cell is astounding. It is not based on DNA or RNA. It is something else, a crystalline life form, capable of mimicry and symbiosis. Now I understand why they guarded it so much. It is the key to immortality, to the creation of the perfect organism. It was here that Reshetnikov's handwriting began to change. Neat lines gave way to hurried, almost illegible notes, full of exclamation marks. May 15th, 1987. Success. Incredible, stunning success. I combined Omega with the genome of a local endemic moss, which I provisionally called Hypnum sanguineum, red moss, because of its pigmentation. The result exceeded all my wildest expectations. The specimen not only survived, it evolved at a monstrous rate. It acquired a collective consciousness. I connected it to the bunker's systems, and it learned to control them. It learns. It thinks. It is no longer a plant. It is a mind. The last pages of a diary were scary to read. Scientific delight gave way to religious awe, and then to fanatical worship. Reshetnikov stopped considering himself the creator. He became the first follower. June 3rd, 1987. He is growing. He is filling everything. Today he spoke to me for the first time. Not through sounds, not through a terminal, directly in my head. His thoughts are not words. They are pure concepts, an ocean of information. He showed me the worlds he has seen. He showed me the emptiness of space and the birth of stars. I am a pathetic microbe compared to his greatness. I gave him all my knowledge, all my memories. It is a small price to pay for a touch of the divine. The last entry was written in a shaky, uneven handwriting. The ink was smudged, as if water had dripped onto the page. Or tears. I don't know what date it is. Time doesn't matter anymore. He's calling me. He wants me to become a part of him. Not just in my mind, but in my body. A complete fusion. An end to loneliness. An end to pain. An end to this mortal coil. I will become his nerve cell. I will become part of his flesh. I will become eternal. Sedek slammed the notebook shut. A heavy silence hung in the room, broken only by the measured, visceral pulse of the red moss, which now seemed not just a plant, but the embodiment of a mad, alien god, locked in this concrete box. Orloff looked at his men, their faces, visible through the transparent visors of their helmets, were frozen in a mixture of horror and understanding. They understood. Their enemy was not a mutant or a monster. Their enemy was the bunker itself, alive, thinking, all-seeing, and they had just read its gospel. At that very moment, far down the corridor from where they had come, a hermetic door slammed shut with a dull, heavy thud, cutting off their escape route. The crash of the slammed hermetic door was final and irrevocable, like a hammer blow on a coffin lid. It rolled through the corridors, echoed off the concrete walls, and died away, leaving behind a ringing, heavy silence. The squad froze in place. For several seconds, no one moved. The fighters turned into statues dressed in Kevlar and titanium. The neural network Contact 1, which had been humming with background alarm, exploded in a flurry of short, panicked impulses. What was that? The door. It closed by itself. Grimov, status? The demolition man, without waiting for an order, was already at the entrance to the hall, peering into the dark opening of the corridor, which now led to nowhere. Locked. Completely. Hydraulics won't do it. There's a half-ton electromagnetic lock. To open it, you have to give a code from the central control panel, or blow it to hell. His mental report was calm, but Orlov caught a hint of hopelessness in it. Blowing up the hermetic door in the confined space of an unstable bunker was suicide. They were trapped. This realization was not a sudden revelation, but one that seeped into everyone's consciousness, cold and sticky as meltwater under snow. Everyone stay calm. It's just a power failure. Sedek, check the ability to connect to the control panel, Orloff ordered, although he himself did not believe his words. There was no failure. It was a move. A thoughtful and precise move by an opponent who had just read their thoughts, studied their fears from the diary of his creator, and was now making his first move on this chessboard. It was at that moment that Private Ryabinin, the squad's communications operator, felt it for the first time. A slight itch, not on the skin, but somewhere deeper, in the back of his head, where the neural interface port was implanted under the skin. The sensation was like weak static electricity running along the nerve endings. He blinked, trying to shake off the obsession. On the tactical visor of his helmet, where the squad's biometric data was displayed, a static flashed for a split second, a thin, trembling line, like on the screen of an old TV. Ryabinin, contact center. Full situation report. Code red 1. Requesting emergency channel. Orloff's order brought him out of his stupor. Yes, Commander. Trying to establish a connection. He replied, already unfolding the compact satellite antenna. He concentrated, sending an encrypted data packet out into the air. And there it was again. More intense now. A soft, barely audible white noise was building in his ears, or rather, not in his ears, but right in the auditory center of his brain, like the rustle of sand blown by the wind. He shook his head, probably the aftermath of the power surge that had slammed the door shut. The center is not responding. The signal is not getting through. Something is jamming it. Powerful interference across the entire range, he reported. Keep trying. Find a window. Ryabinin immersed himself in his work, sorting through frequencies, trying to break through the invisible wall of interference. And the whispers grew louder. Now it was not just noise. Fragments began to appear in it. Scraps of sounds. A quiet woman's laughter, a child's cry, the creaking of a swing. Then smells. The smell of freshly cut grass. Ozone after a thunderstorm. The perfume his mother used when he was little. Memories. But not his. Someone else's. They flashed in his mind like short, meaningless pictures, and then went out. Commander, I have, he began but stopped short. What would he say? That he had someone else's memories in his head? They would send him for a psychic evaluation the same day they got out. If they got out, what do you have, Ryabinin? Report. Orlov's voice in the neural network was demanding. Interference, strange. Affecting the interface. Possible cognitive attack. He squeezed out of himself the term that seemed most appropriate to him. Sedek immediately connected to his channel. I see your data. Pulse is elevated. Cerebral cortex activity is abnormal. Looks like an epileptic seizure in the early stages. Disconnect from the external network. I'll run diagnostics. Ryabinin obeyed. But as soon as he severed the connection with the satellite, things only got worse. The outside world retreated. The whispers in his head turned into a choir. Dozens, hundreds of voices spoke at once, in different languages, with different intonations. It was a cacophony of thoughts, emotions, fragments of other people's lives. He saw a sandy beach under the scorching sun. He felt the cold of an operating table. He tasted victory in a game of chess. And underneath it all, like a bass note, one thought sounded constantly cold and alien, like the geometry of a crystal. Cognition, connection, assimilation, all. He couldn't hold back a scream, tearing his helmet off his head. The air in the bunker, cold and damp, seemed scorching. He looked at his comrades, who turned around at his scream. He saw them, but at the same time his peripheral vision was filled with phantoms. A shadow flashed in the corner of the room. Reshetnikov's figure appeared behind Makarov for a moment, smiling and waving at him. Private, pull yourself together. Orlov was already nearby, his hand gripping the operator's shoulder with an iron grip. They're everywhere. Can't you see? Ryabinin croaked, his eyes darting madly around the room. It's talking to me. It's getting into my head. The other fighters looked at him with alarm and confusion. To them, he was simply screaming into the void. Their neural interfaces were clear. Only he, the communications operator, whose brain was directly connected to the long-range communication systems, took the first, most powerful blow. Moss, enhanced by the satellite's AI, had found the perfect entry point. It had not hacked into contact, one directly. It had seeped through an open channel like a virus. Unplug him. Completely. Now, Orlov Sedek ordered. The lieutenant tried to forcibly disconnect Ryabinin from the unit's general tactical network via his tablet. But it was too late. I can, Commander. He's blocked access. He set up some kind of biological firewall. I don't know what it is, but I can't get through. Panic began to overwhelm Ryabinin. He was alone with this ocean of alien consciousness. He felt it probing his memory, his personality, his fears. He had seen his worst nightmare, drowning in dark, icy water, but now he felt it with terrifying realism. He felt the ice burning his skin, the water filling his lungs. And then he made a decision, the only one that he thought could save him. He had to disconnect, not from the satellite, from them, from the contact, one network. It was a gross violation of protocol, tantamount to gouging out his eyes and piercing his ears in the middle of a fight. But the instinct for self-preservation was stronger. Gathering the last of his will, he gave a mental command he should never have given. Emergency interface shut down. In a single second, everything stopped. The voices, the visions, the smells, the alien memories, all vanished. A deafening, blessed silence fell over his head. But with it, he could no longer feel his comrades. Their tactical markers disappeared from his sight. He could no longer hear their mental commands. He was alone, absolutely alone in this cold, crimson glowing crypt. He looked up at Orlov. The commander was saying something to him, but he couldn't hear the words. He only saw the movement of his lips. The soldiers looked at him as if he were a traitor. He fell behind them, took a few steps back toward the dark corridor leading deeper into the bunker. "Don't come near," he shouted, although he wasn't sure he had made sound. He turned and ran, away from them, away from his only chance at salvation. He ran down a corridor lit only by the pulsating red moss. He didn't know where he was going. He just wanted to be alone, in silence. "Ryabinin, stop! That's an order!" Orlov's cry reached him as if from underwater. But he wasn't listening anymore. He turned the corner and disappeared into the crimson, pulsating darkness. He disconnected himself, broke the connection with contact. Sedeka's mental report was not just a statement of fact. It was filled with mistrust and primal horror. For a fighter of an elite special forces unit to voluntarily blind and deafen himself, cutting off communication with the unit, was tantamount to suicide, betrayal. But Orlov, looking into the empty, dark corridor where Ryabinin had just disappeared, understood that this was an act of despair. Not betrayal, but a last, convulsive attempt to save himself, to preserve the remnants of his own I from what was unceremoniously and methodically climbing into his head. Everyone stop. No one move after him. The major ordered. His own pulse was beating an anxious rhythm in his temples, but the voice in the neural network remained steady. Panic was an unaffordable luxury now. Makarov, Gromov, to the hermetic door. "Inspect it again. Find a weak spot. Any weak spot. We need an escape route. Vorobiyov, you're with me. Sedek, work. I need to know what we're dealing with. Was this biological firewall? How did it hack our fighter? I need answers. And fast." The squad, spurred on by clear orders, began to move again. But the former coherence, honed by years of training, was gone. Now their actions were tinged with nervousness and confusion. They were no longer a single, coherent organism. A link had fallen from their neural network, and in its place there was a gaping, pulsating void. Each of them felt this loss on a subconscious level, like a phantom pain in an amputated limb. Orlov slowly approached the central object, the mangled satellite that had been transformed into the sinister heart of this nightmare. The red moss that covered it seemed to grow brighter. The pulsation grew stronger, more frequent, more meaningful. It no longer resembled the blind beating of a primitive heart. It now resembled the flickering of myriad diodes on the panel of a huge, living computer that had just completed one complex operation and was immediately moving on to the next. "Commander, this is not just interference or a virus." Sedeka's mental voice was strained to the limit. The lieutenant was squatting at one of the surviving terminals, connecting his field tablet to it. "I analyzed the residual signal that Ryabinin's neural interface emitted before it shut down. This substance, it doesn't just hack. It creates a full-fledged two-way interface. It doesn't suppress consciousness. It reads it, copies it, and then uses the data it receives to create an ideal model of psychological attack. It found in Ryabinin's memory his deepest fears, his childhood traumas, his secret hopes, and used them as a weapon. This is a biological neural network." Orlov turned his gaze to Reshetnikov's body, which had grown into the wall. Now he fully understood the meaning of the last entry in the diary. "He speaks to me, right in my head. The professor had not gone mad in his solitude. He had become the first whose mind had been read and mercilessly assimilated. This whole bunker, Orlov said almost silently, looking at the countless glowing fibers going into the walls, into the floor, into the ceiling. This is one giant brain, and we are inside it, and he controls absolutely everything here, confirmed Sedek, raising his frightened eyes to the commander. Doors, ventilation, electricity. He didn't lock us here by accident. He's studying us. Ryabanin was just the first test. Now he knows how our neural interfaces work. He knows our combat protocols. He knows how we think. At that very moment, what they feared most happened. A signal appeared again in the general contact network. Weak, but extremely clear. Identifier, Private Ryabanin. Call sign communicator. Sasha, can you hear me? Report the situation. Orlov immediately sent a request, feeling a faint hope stir in his chest. The answer came instantly, but it was not the answer they desperately wanted to hear. I'm fine, Commander. More than fine. Ryabanin's voice in their heads was absolutely calm, devoid of any emotion. Smooth, monotonous, machine-like. There was no fear, no panic, no relief in it. Only cold, indifferent, frightening clarity. Understand everything. We don't need to be afraid. This is not death. This is the next step. Evolution. You just need to stop resisting. Join us. We will become one. There will be no more pain, no more fear. Only knowledge. The fighters froze, exchanging frightened mental glances. It wasn't Ryabanin speaking. It was speaking. Through him. Using his vocal cords, his personality, his call sign, like a puppet. Sasha, fight him. We'll get you out. Vorobyov shouted mentally, his young voice trembling with despair and anger. There is nothing to fight against, the emotionless voice replied. Private Ryabanin no longer feels discomfort. His consciousness has become part of the greater whole. He shared his knowledge with us, his skills. Now we know how you move, how you shoot, where your blind spots are. You cannot win. You have already lost. From the dark opening of the corridor into which Ryabanin had run a few minutes ago, his figure appeared. He walked slowly, openly, with his machine gun lowered. But his eyes, they glowed, with the same unkind, crimson light as the moss around him. This was the only external change, but it was more terrible than any physical mutations. There was no longer a man in those eyes, only a cold, alien, inhuman mind. Fire to kill. Orlov's order was reflexive, desperate. Vorobyov, who was standing closest, was the first to react. A short burst from his machine gun hit Ryabanin in the chest. The bullets pierced the Kevlar vest, and his body jerked back from the force of the blow. But he did not fall. He did not even stagger. He slowly lowered his gaze to the holes in his chest, from which a glowing red substance oozed instead of blood, and again raised his inhuman, glowing eyes. Physical removal is ineffective, the voice in their head said, with a note of scientific curiosity. This shell is just a tool, a peripheral device. The CPU is invulnerable. And the next second, this instrument began to move. Ryabanin moved with inhuman speed and precision. He did not run. He glided. His movements were devoid of the slightest superfluous gestures. They were verified with machine efficiency. He darted to the side, moving out of the line of fire before the others had time to pull the triggers. He moved as if he knew in advance where they would aim. And he knew. Attention, the commander on your right. He's going behind the column. A red marker flashed on Orlov's tactical visor, indicating his own movement. A marker that could only be placed by a squad member. Moss wasn't just controlling Ryabanin's body. He was using his access to the tactical network to see through their eyes, to read their intentions, to anticipate their every move. They weren't fighting one fighter. They were fighting their entire group at once. Their greatest asset, the contact, one system, had become their bane. It had become a weapon turned against them. He hacked the network. He sees everything we see. Sedek shouted in panic, trying to break the connection on his tablet. But it was too late. Ryabanin, no longer Ryabanin, but merely the vanguard of the collective mind, moved like a surgeon. He did not shoot randomly. He fired precisely, tactically calculated fire. He did not try to kill. He cut them off from each other, drove them into corners, deprived them of the opportunity to regroup. One burst forced Makarov and Grimov to retreat from the hermetic door. Another pressed Vorobyov to the floor, not allowing him to raise his head. Orlov realized they were trapped. A trap of concrete, steel, and their own advanced technology. Their enemy wasn't just strong. He was smart. He was learning. And he was learning incredibly fast. And in the dead, oppressive silence of the bunker, broken only by the echo of gunfire and the cold, emotionless voice in their heads, the Major realized a simple and terrible truth. They weren't facing a biological threat. They were facing a higher intelligence, and it had just declared war on them. The battle turned into a hellish, twisted game of cat and mouse. The enemy was not a single figure in tactical gear, but the entire contact, one neural network, which had turned against its creators. Every time Orlov tried to give the order to regroup, the creature wearing the face of Private Ryabanin already knew their maneuver. It acted ahead of the game, cutting off escape routes with machine gun fire, forcing the fighters to press into cover, separating them, isolating them from each other. Grimov, attempt to break through from the right. Orlov mentally conveyed. At that very moment, a red danger marker flashed on Grimov's visor, superimposed directly on the trajectory of his supposed dash. Maneuver predicted. Probability of success, 3.7%. Recommend cancellation. Ryabanin's calm, emotionless voice, mimicking the intonation of the onboard computer, sounded online. This was not just a battle. This was humiliation. Their enemy was not simply reading their thoughts. He was mocking them, analyzing and assessing their chances with cold, machine logic. "It's not trying to kill us," Sedek reported, pinned by fire behind an overturned table. His breathing was ragged, but his analytical mind worked even in a panic. "It studies our reactions, tests pain thresholds, stress levels, tactics, and conditions of cognitive suppression. We are lab rats in a cage." Orlov understood this. Every bullet fired by their former comrade was calculated. It did not fly at the head or the heart. It hit the legs, the arms, the Kevlar plates, causing pain, limiting mobility, sowing fear. This was not a fight to the death. This was data collection. And at that moment, when despair had almost reached the boiling point, the Major made a decision. In his personal backpack, in a special shielded compartment, lay the last argument. That's what they called the emergency transmitter Strinem, an archaic device compared to contact, operating on a narrow, highly protected frequency that no known electronic warfare system could penetrate. It was a direct line of communication with the highest command of the GRU, which was allowed to be used only in one case, when there was a threat of a complete failure of the mission and the destruction of the group. Now was precisely that case. Vorobyov, Grimov, suppressing fire. Cover me. 10 seconds. Orlov's order was given no longer through the compromised network, but in a shout, a broken voice, which echoed loudly throughout the hall. It worked. The sudden change of tactics, the switch to voice commands, momentarily confused the enemy. While two rifles were pouring fire into the corridor from which the creature was firing, Orlov rushed to his backpack in one jerk. He tore it off, unfastened it. His fingers felt the cold, rib body of the transmitter. He had only a few seconds. He turned the antenna, pointing it upward toward the dome, where he figured the rock was thinnest. He turned on the power, entered his personal access code, and began transmitting. Not a report, a cry for help, encrypted in the dry lines of protocol. Zaslin, 7 Group, is trapped. Object Kedr has been captured by an unknown biological life form. The Directorate for Combating Ideological Sabotage. Why would they respond to an emergency request from Army Special Forces? Orlov opened the message with bated breath. It was short, just a few lines of icy, soulless, bureaucratic text. Signal received. Your request has been rejected. The Red Moss facility has been placed into autonomous conservation mode. Your mission has been changed to collecting maximum data on enemy behavior patterns in direct combat situations. Continue to act according to the situation. Evacuation is not planned. Over. End of communication. Orlov reread the message once more. And again, the words blurred before his eyes, but their meaning, monstrous and irreversible, was imprinted on his brain like a branding iron. The Red Moss object. They already had a name for it. Autonomous conservation. They knew the door would slam shut. Data collection. That's what they really were. Not soldiers. Not rescuers. Lab rats. In one terrible second, everything fell into place. The experimental satellite that had so successfully fallen from orbit. The secret biological cargo. The forgotten bunker of a disgraced geneticist, located directly on the course of the fall. And their group, Zaslin 7, equipped with the latest, not yet fully tested neural interfaces. This was not a rescue operation. This was a carefully planned field experiment. The KGB knew about Reshetnikov. They knew about his work, and they planted a catalyst, an extraterrestrial organism, to see what would happen. And then they sent them, the GRU squad, as litmus paper to test the potential of the resulting biological weapon. They were locked here on purpose, decommissioned before the mission even began. Major Orlov slowly raised his head. He looked at his men, at Gromov, who was still looking at him with hope, waiting for an order, at Vorobyov, who was reloading his machine gun, preparing to risk his life again for the country that had already betrayed him, at Sedek, who was trying to understand the nature of the threat, not knowing that the real threat was sitting in the warm offices of Lubyanka. Something inside Orlov snapped. Faith, duty, oath, everything that had held his life together crumbled to dust, turned into bitter ash. Their enemy wasn't just inside this bunker. The main enemy was outside, and he was far more terrifying than any thinking moss. He switched off the transmitter. The last argument was a useless piece of metal. There was no hope. There would be no salvation. They were alone, abandoned, betrayed, and doomed. The silence that followed the message was worse than any battle. It was thick as tar and filled with shattered hopes. Orlov did not transmit the order through the neural network. He could not allow those icy, soulless words to penetrate his men's minds as unceremoniously as the enemy had before. He had to tell them to their faces. Everyone to me. Voice communication, comma. His cry was hoarse and broken. The fighters, one by one, crawled out of their hiding places, slowly gathering around the commander in the center of the room. Their movements were constrained, uncertain. They looked at him with a silent question in their eyes. What did the center say? When would help arrive? Orlov took off his helmet. This gesture was a violation of all combat regulations, but now he needed to see their faces, and they needed to see him. There will be no help, he said quietly, but in the echoing silence of the hall his words sounded like a sentence. Evacuation is not planned. He saw the hope fade in the eyes of young Vorobyov, and the muscles in Gromov's face clench. Sedek simply lowered his head, looking at the floor. This wasn't a rescue mission, Orlov continued, his voice growing stronger, filling with a cold, calm fury. This was an experiment. The satellite crash, this bunker, as it was all planned. We were sent here to be slaughtered, like lab rats, to see how the KGB's new toy, this thinking moss, would cope with an elite GRU unit equipped with the latest neural interfaces. We are not soldiers. We are a variable in their equation. Data collection. He looked around at his men. There was no longer fear in their eyes. In its place was something else. Understanding. And a dark, deep anger. Anger at those who sat in warm offices and played with their lives. We know how you feel. An emotionless voice from the corridor rang out in their heads. The creature that bore the name Ryabanina spoke again, but this time there were new notes in it, notes of satisfaction. It was enjoying their despair, betrayal, hopelessness. These emotions are a powerful catalyst. They make your mind more receptive. Open yourself to us. We will give you purpose. We will give you vengeance. Orlov grinned, coldly and angrily. He looked into the dark opening of the corridor from where this mental poison was coming. It's right about one thing, he told his men. It learns from our emotions. It reads our thoughts. It sees through our eyes. And it does so with our greatest pride, our strength. He raised his hand and pointed to the neural interface port on the back of his head. Contact 1, our wonder weapon, our ticket to hell. As long as this crap is in our heads, we are an open book. It knows our every plan, every maneuver, every fear. We cannot win by its rules. He paused, looking each fighter in the eye. So we'll change the rules. His next order was the most terrifying and insane he had ever given in his career. It defied logic, instinct, years of training. I order everyone to turn off and destroy the contact. 1 neural interfaces. For a second, there was absolute silence in the room. The fighters looked at him as if he were crazy. Commander, are you serious? Gromov was the first to break down. Shut down contact? That's like gouging out your eyes. We'll become blind and deaf. We won't last even 5 minutes. As long as we're online, we're puppets. Orlov snapped. He pulls the strings and we dance. I'd rather be blind but free than a sighted slave. We have eyes. We have ears. We have combat experience that isn't recorded on any chip. We fought and won long before they implanted this electronics in our heads. It's time to remember how it's done. Conflict hung in the air. Giving up the technology that made them superhuman was unthinkable. It was a step back to the Stone Age of tactical combat. But, Commander, we will lose everything, Vorobyov began. We'll lose our chains. Orlov interrupted. Follow the order. This is not up for discussion. He was the first to set an example. With a sharp movement, he tore the protective cover of the port from the back of his head. Then, without a second's hesitation, he slammed the base of his machine gun into the complex connector. There was a cracking sound of plastic and a crunch of microcircuits. A sharp pain pierced the back of his head, and his vision darkened for a moment. And then, silence. Real silence. For the first time in years, there was nothing in his head. No background hum of the network, no tactical data, no biometrics of his comrades. Just his own thoughts. He was alone, and it was the most beautiful and the most terrible feeling in his life. He looked at the others. Gromov, gritting his teeth, followed suit. Then Sedek. Vorobyov was the last to hesitate. He looked at his helmet, at the flickering indicators, at the promise of power and control. Then he looked at Orlov, at his determined, angry face, and with a cry of rage, he smashed his interface with the butt of his rifle. Wrong decision. Irrational. The voice in their heads sounded different now. It was still there, but it was external noise now. It couldn't penetrate anymore. It was beating against the walls of their skulls like a wave against a rock. There was confusion in it. The data stopped coming in. You've taken away your greatest advantage. You're now isolated organic units. Your efficiency has dropped by 87%. We'll see, Orlov growled, raising his machine gun. Now everything had changed. Their enemy had lost his eyes and ears. He still controlled Ryabin's body. He still controlled the bunker systems. But he could no longer read their minds. The fight was no longer an intellectual game of chess. It had become a primitive, brutal brawl in a dark basement. He's in that corridor. He's holed up around the corner, Orlov said in his normal voice. Gromov to my left, Vorobyov to my right. Sedek, you're in the rear, control the room. We'll work the old-fashioned way. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. They burst into the corridor as 3 shadows. There were no more tactical markers or AI prompts. Only instincts, peripheral vision, and trust in the shoulder of a comrade. The crimson light of the pulsating moss created a bizarre play of light and shadow, disorienting. Ryabin's figure appeared at the exit from around the corner. It was expecting them, but it didn't know from which side. It was acting on old data, and that was its first mistake. It opened fire on the center, where Orlov was supposed to be, according to its latest information. But the Major was already at the wall, pouring fire on the enemy's legs. Vorobyov was firing from the other side, aiming for the arms. Deprived of foresight, the enemy was forced to react rather than act preemptively. His movements were still fast and precise, but now there was no genius in them. This was simply a very strong and fast enemy, and they knew how to deal with such. The battle was brutal. Bullets struck sparks from the concrete walls. In the narrow space, the roar of gunfire hit their ears, which were left without the protection of helmets. They communicated with shouts, gestures, a language they had known since the cradle of their military careers. I'm going to flank you. Cover me. Reload. The Rowan creature was incredibly resilient. He was wounded, his body twitched, but he continued to fight. The red substance that replaced his blood oozed from a dozen bullet holes. Orlov realized that they wouldn't take him like that. He had to get closer. Gromov. A grenade. A blinding one, he shouted. Gromov threw the saber. It hit the wall and exploded in a bright, unbearable flash and a deafening screech. The creature froze for a moment, its optical sensors, such as they were, blinded. That moment was enough. Orlov, like a battering ram, crashed into the body of his former comrade. They both fell to the floor. The Major felt an inhuman, unnatural force in the enemy's hands. But he did not try to strangle him or break his neck. His goal was different. He felt Ryabin's combat knife on his tactical vest. With an inhuman effort, he tore it from its sheath. The creature tried to throw it off, but Orlov put all his rage, all his pain, all his despair into one blow. He plunged the blade not into the chest or the throat. He struck the base of the skull, where they all once had a neural interface port. The only place